I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest is Millard Grimes, who is a well-known newspaper man and author. Millard, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
You are a newspaper man. You literally grew up in the newspaper business, working as a copy boy, a proofreader, and a sports reporter for the Columbus Ledger while you were still in high school.
That's right. I've never made a dollar since then in any business except publishing newspapers or magazines, and so I guess I'm a newspaper man.
You were born in Newnan.
Yeah, I was born in Newnan in 1930, just a few months after the Wall Street crash that ushered in the Great Depression. My father lost his job during that time, and so I only lived in Newnan a few weeks as a baby, and although that was the county, Coweta County, was where the families of both my parents had lived for generations, and a lot of them are still buried there around the Welcome Church, if you know where that is, or the Elam Church in the Welcome community. But we moved to LaGrange when I was still a baby, as I said, and so I grew up in LaGrange, which actually was a great place to grow up in the 1930s. It was a small town, about 20,000, but it was a cotton mill town, I guess. But we lived only about a block from what you might call downtown. So you could walk everywhere. You could walk to the theater, the stores on Main Street, to the church. So actually I had access to a lot of that stuff, and back in those days, of course, a kid could walk all over town by himself if he wanted to. And we were poor, I guess you'd have to say. I don't think my father ever made much more than $20 a week, 25 maybe some. He was a traveling salesman for the Culpeper Company there. I've often said we were so poor we could hardly afford a maid, because maids then were $2 a week. So we did afford a maid, which was fortunate, because my mother was sickly and stayed in the bed most of the time. And then my father, he traveled a lot. He didn't get home a lot, sometimes on purpose and sometimes because he had to work. And I think he sort of took to drinking during this period, and some nights didn't come home at all. But my grandmother came to live with us, and so I guess my grandmother sort of raised me. But we live right there on Broome Street. I don't know whether you know where that is or not, in LaGrange, but it's just, like I say, right off the square. But I loved growing up in LaGrange because it was such a big difference in those days, in the 1930s. If you lived in a relatively urban area, I guess you would call it, and about 2 to 3 miles away, outside the city limits, people didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity, they didn't have a lot of the comforts we now have, and the difference was just maybe a couple of miles. And it wasn't how rich or poor you were, it was actually if you lived in a town, or if you lived out in the country, no matter how rich you were, you usually had to have a well, and it was a long time before you got electricity. So growing up in a small town, also you had access to stores much easier, and theaters. I keep saying the movie theater because, back in the 30s, going to the movie for a dime was the big entertainment for children. And I started buying Big Little books, if you remember those, comic books and things like that. And I was always a reader, and really always wanted to be a writer. And I really started out wanting to be a fiction writer, and wrote a lot of stories. Wrote stories for comic books and science fiction, the pulp magazines as I got into my teenage years. But I soon realized it was going to be hard to make a living at a penny a word. I just couldn't write that many words, and so I in the summer of my junior year at Columbus High, I went down and applied for a job at the Ledger-Enquirer, the daily newspaper there. And they had a job for proofreader during the vacations of the other proofreader, even though I was only 16 years old, which I thought was a little young for that job. And then I was a copy boy on Saturdays. They don't have copy boys anymore, and sometimes I'm not sure they have proofreaders anymore. Everybody has to kind of proofread their own stuff. But the copy boy was very important in those days. He not only had to go get coffee for all the people in the newsroom, which was very important, but he had to strip the wires and later wind up the paper tape that was sent by the wire services that you put through the linotype machines. So if the copy boy didn't come in the morning around 5 or 6 o'clock, the editors didn't have any wire copy, which back in those days was extremely important because we didn't have near as much local as they do today. But in any case, that was my introduction, and I worked at the Columbus paper during my years here at the university in the summers. My father died when I was a senior in high school, and my mother used the money to sort of send me through school, his insurance money, and that's how I happened to get through Georgia.
So you came to the University of Georgia to study journalism.
Yeah.
I'm sure you must have worked on the Red and Black.
Yeah, absolutely. I went down to the Red and Black first week or so I was here and worked on it till my senior year when I worked on the Pandora, the yearbook.
What was the university like in those days?
Well, it was, I think, great, but I had never been anywhere much. I'd been to Athens once. I came up here to cover a track meet when I was a senior in high school. I started writing sports for the Columbus paper, and I'd been to Florida a couple of times. So like I say, we didn't travel much during the war, we didn't go anywhere. So Athens, of course, today, people say it's a lot different, and I guess sure it is. But when I was walking over here today, I realized that I could still find my way because it was similar to the way it was when I was a student and used to walk on North Campus a lot. And it was right after World War II, so there were a lot of the men students, I'd say probably more than half of the men students were veterans coming on the GI Bill. And of course, men outnumbered women about 5 to 1 on the campus in those days. And I was a fuzzy-faced 17-year-old who came up in 1947 as a freshman at 17. I'd been about 15 when the war ended, so I missed the war, or at least as a service person. And so it was certainly really hard to get a date for a guy who didn't have much money and who was younger than most of the other men. And we lived out in the prefabs on Ag Hill, the prefabs, they stayed there, I think, till the 60s. And then I moved over on Millage Avenue for my last 3 years. And but I worked, the Red and Black, I would have to say, was the best training ground for newspaper people that you could have had. And the people who owned the Red and Black during the period I was there were just went on to have very successful careers in journalism. When I was editor, John Pennington was the managing editor, who Jimmy Carter gives a lot of credit for saving his political career when he investigated a voting fraud that kept Carter from winning his first race. Jim Minna was the sports editor, who went on to become the editor of the Atlanta papers. Dewey Benefeld, who didn't stay in newspapers, but who became a very prominent developer down in Sea Island, was there. Mike Edwards, who went on to become a writer on National Geographic and is still writing for National Geographic. Glenn Vaughn, who went on to be the publisher of the Columbus newspapers. There was just it was an unusual group of people there. And some of them were veterans and some of them weren't, like Jim and I weren't, and Dewey. So the Red and Black, as I've often told folks, was the most exacting newspaper at that time that I have ever worked on. Every line had to fit. Every headline had to fit just right, and we rewrote them time and time again. And of course, we printed here in Athens at an old print shop. But it was an experience that if you went through all the rungs on the ladder, when you got out, you could put out a newspaper, a real newspaper, I think, and I think a lot of those people did.
You were there during the Sinkwich Trippy years.
Well, no, I missed those. I was there right after that. I saw Sinkwich Trippy play several times because they played the Georgia-Auburn game in Columbus every year at that time. Mm-hmm. And so we got to usher at the Georgia-Auburn games when I was in high school. In fact, one of my great scoops when I was at sports editor of the high school paper, I got an interview with Charlie Trippy in the lobby of the Ralston Hotel. I called up his room. I'm not usually that brash. And Charlie Trippy answered. I asked him to meet me down in the lobby, and so I interviewed him a little bit about his. It was one of the Georgia-Auburn games, but no, they had left. Roush and that group were here. Zippy Morocco, who's still here in Athens. I was talking to Zippy the other day, and but I think it was a great time to be at the university. We had big bands come in for all the the big dances like homecoming and little commencement. And you didn't have city wasn't as big. Certainly didn't have any bars. In fact, I don't think you could serve drinks in Athens at that time. Although a lot of people managed to get some, but it was a great time to be here.
So after graduation, you wound up back in Columbus.
Yes.
Let's talk about in 1955.
Okay.
When your newspaper won the Pulitzer Prize for documenting evidence that there was corruption in Phoenix City, which is across the river.
That's right.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was an interesting year, needless to say. And I would like to say that as it was on the Red and Black when I was here at Georgia, we had an unusual group of people on the Columbus Ledger during that time. Who went on to great. Bob Brown was the editor, and I think he was the person most responsible for us getting the Pulitzer. Bob had worked with Harding Carter in Mississippi on that Delta paper, and he came, and then he went through NBC and came to the Ledger-Enquirer. He was fairly young, I guess his middle 30s. And he died fairly young, but he did help us get that Pulitzer. He was a very good political journalist in the sense that he knew all the people in the business. Well, we overplayed the story, quite frankly. I mean, the key to cleaning up Phoenix City was that Albert Patterson, an attorney in Phoenix City, pledged to clean it up, was elected Attorney General of Alabama. And one night, in a dark alley downtown, he was shot to death. And on June 18th, 1954, I always remember that night. Well, when he was shot and killed, that naturally created a lot of attention on Phoenix City, which had been corrupt for years and years. I mean, going back to the riverfront days when riverboats came in, and it was a gambling center. And of course, Fort Benning being across the bridge there helped create the need, not the need, but a lot of nightclubs and so forth. And we used to go over there a lot. My wife and my fiancée at that time, and the people from the Ledger-Enquirer, and frankly, I never saw that much corruption. I mean, they could serve drinks, and they had dancing, and I guess they had gambling and things like that in the back rooms, but I never saw any, and other things. But in any case, when Patterson was killed, the governor of Alabama declared martial law in Phoenix City and sent the National Guard in. And the National Guard took over the entire government of Russell County and Phoenix City. You had a National Guardsman who was the sheriff and another one who was the police chief, and all the people who were there were ousted. Then they brought in a special grand jury from all over the state and a judge. And in the next 9 months, they charged and convicted a lot of the gamblers, which they felt would never have happened with the old regime in place. So then they arrested the Solicitor General of Russell County, the deputy sheriff, and the Attorney General of Alabama, the guy who was Attorney General at the time, and charged them with Patterson's murder. It was a very interesting trial. Now, the district attorney was probably the most powerful politician in the county, a fellow named Arch Farrell. And at the trial, the witnesses testified, several of them, they saw Farrell and the deputy sheriff, Fuller, shoot Patterson in this alley right there. I'll tell you a little interesting story about that alley in a minute. It was right on the main street of Phoenix City at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. So a lot of people walking up and down the street. But it was a little off the sidewalk. But despite eyewitnesses, and the main eyewitness, by the way, was killed in a knife fight before the trial, just a coincidence according to the books and all that. And I recently read a book about this, why I'm so can remember it well, because I just read a very good new book out about the assassination. In any case, Fuller was convicted, the deputy sheriff. Farrell was acquitted. The Attorney General went to a sanatorium, as they called it back then, in Texas, and was declared unfit, mentally unfit to stand trial. And of course, he wasn't in Phoenix City that night. In fact, Farrell's defense was he was talking to him on the phone. Now, I won't get into all those details, but in any case, he was supposed to have helped plot it, though. John Patterson, Albert Patterson's son, of course, was elected in his place to be Attorney General, and later was elected governor, defeating in 1958 George C. Wallace, the only time Wallace ever lost an election in his career. As Patterson beat him, but despite Patterson being the Attorney General, they did acquit the guy he really felt was the person who was responsible for the assassination. And Farrell died in prison after about not Farrell, but Fuller died in prison about 7 years later. But in any case, you're getting back to that. We played up all this stuff, of course, and ran many stories on it. I'm trying to remember exactly what we did that revealed things. I think we kept the story alive because we bannered it every day, and we had lots of news sources, and but the key was the governor declaring martial law and sending in the troops to find out why Patterson had been murdered. And they cleaned out all the gambling establishments. They threw out slot machines. They destroyed the places, and of course arrested the gamblers. So yeah, we won the Pulitzer Prize, and we're real proud. But as Ray Jenkins, who's still a real good friend of mine, used to, and was the main reporter at that time in Phoenix City, said we kind of overplayed the story. But the sequel to that is on the day we won the Pulitzer Prize, it was announced, I had already resigned and had decided to go over to Phoenix City and start a weekly newspaper. They had a small weekly, but it was not very good. So I got this guy ran the radio station over there, put up $2,000. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so I got an office in the same building that Patterson had had his office in and had walked down the steps from the night he was murdered. And so we had an office there for about 2 years, and I tried my hand at weekly newspapers then.
Well, actually, you must have liked it, because even today you own several weekly newspapers.
Well, I don't know that I liked it that much. And of course, I didn't have any money much, and we didn't have a print shop. And the pace was so different from a daily. Still is. I mean, you have to really make yourself on a weekly go on and do things, whereas a daily sort of the deadline forces you to. Actually, that experience convinced me at that time that I wanted to just be involved with dailies if I could. And so I went back. The Columbus paper took me back, which was fortunate, since I've been very lucky through the years to have a job somewhere. And I went back to the Columbus paper, and I left one other time for a few months to work on the paper in the Valley, which had just gone cold type. And it was owned by a guy named Carmage Walls, whom you may be familiar with. Carmage had been publisher of the Macon Telegraph, and he also had a hand in more weekly news dailies and weeklies, I think, than anybody in the country, because he helped young people start it. And his stepson was the publisher, I think, in Valley at that time. But I went up there briefly. But I had a family situation. Both of our mothers lived with us, my wife's mother and grandmother and my mother, and we almost had to stay in Columbus, but we tried it for a while. Well, I was going to say about the people on the Ledger-Enquirer, when I worked there as a young copy boy, Jim Fain was the news editor, who later went on to Atlanta and became the managing editor there, and then went on to be a big official in Cox newspapers. Jim Bellows was the city editor, and Jim became editor of the New York Herald Tribune. And Tom Sellers and Ray Jenkins and various other people who went on to pretty good careers. Joe Hall, I think he also went to Atlanta. So we had an unusual staff. Carlton Johnson. Later, when I was editor, I brought in Charlie Black, and we sent him to Vietnam 7 times. And Charlie, I think, became sort of a legend covering Vietnam during the 1960s. It was great.
That was a good decision you made.
Yeah. Did you know Charlie?
Yes. And he, you got firsthand coverage from Vietnam that other newspapers in the state really didn't get.
Well, Charlie wanted to go. He had been in World War II and in the Korean War, and he interviewed the soldiers and the people more than the officials. So he didn't depend on news from other, the official sources. And we got letters from all over the country of people wanting Charlie's items because they included names of their sons, fathers, and husbands who were in Vietnam. And Charlie died fairly young too, and was memorial service. The guy who won the Pulitzer Prize for Vietnam service was there and called Charlie the greatest reporter of the Vietnam era because he did report on the people that is soldiers who were actually fighting. And I think it did give us a boost because during that period the Enquirer became the largest circulated paper in Columbus. The Ledger had always been the top paper, and of course they used some of his articles too, but back in those days the newspapers had separate staffs. The Ledger was the afternoon paper, the Enquirer was the morning paper. Of course, as we know, morning papers were then gaining traction to become the more circulated than the afternoon papers. And that was a period, of course, I was editor too. I became editor when I was just 32 in 1962, and had come back to the Ledger-Enquirer from my little excursion to the Valley, and I was working on the desk again, the same job I had when I got out of college, making about $100 a week. And we had 2 children, and that was probably the low point of our career, I mean, our lives in a way. But then, by a series of coincidences, I became editor in a couple of years. The editor of the Enquirer died one night of a heart attack. And I was already writing a column and a lot of the editorials. I just used to do it on the side, although I was really the wire. And so I got to be the associate editor because I was writing the editorials, although back in those days, the editor overlooked the whole operation, not just the editorial page, but somebody had to write the editorial. So then they reorganized, and somehow I ended up as editor of the morning paper, although I'd never worked on it. I always worked on the afternoon paper. And that was a period when Carl Sanders was running for governor and had just, and was elected. So my years as editor of the Enquirer coincided with his first term, and that was a great period in Georgia history, I feel.
Did you ever know Bill Burson, who was a correspondent in Korea?
Yeah, mm-hmm. I knew him. He was in college when I was.
He was here when you were here?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bill and I worked together as press agents for our governors, as you well know. Mm-hmm. In your book, The Last Linotype, the story of Georgia and its newspapers since World War II, you describe the years between 1950 and the 80s as the golden age of newspapers. Mm-hmm. What was so special about that era?
Well, first, I think newspapers' values went up. The value of the papers, that is, not. It was the years when newspapers began to go on the stock market, so you could judge their value. The big papers, small papers. If you were fairly successful, these big groups were always calling you, wanting to buy you if you went on an area they liked. So it was certainly golden from that standpoint. Also, we had changed from hot type by then, most newspapers, to cold type and offset, which allowed us to run many more pictures and local pictures. As you know, in the older, before offset, you had to have a plate made of every picture you ran. It was costly, among other things. Well, after offset, you could just run picture pages pretty easy, and it eventually you could run color much more easier. So it gave newspapers a chance to run more pictures. Frankly, most of the, I don't know whether this is good or bad, but for whatever it was worth, most of the editors and reporters by then were college graduates, because they'd gone to college on the GI Bill, whereas before World War II, it was people, who weren't. I don't know whether it improved it. Some of them were good and some of them weren't. But plus, there was very little competition for the advertising, as there is now, and later. Newspapers were the medium in town, I guess you'd have to say. The publishers and editors were fairly prominent people. After the chains bought up most of the small dailies and many weeklies, of course, the publisher just became another person that the chain happened to send in for a few years, rather than somebody who had lived in the community for many years. And they certainly improved a lot of papers, but they also deproved some. But my experience during that period, of course, was in 1969, I left the Ledger-Enquirer and got some lawyers in Opelika, Alabama, to help to put some money up to buy the paper in Opelika, the Opelika Daily News. And so we did, and I became publishing editor of it March 1969. And that was a great experience. I'd never had a business course in my life, and I mainly continued to do what I'd always done. I put the paper out every day. and got somebody else to sell the ads and do the business. And we had about 6,000 circulation, and didn't circulate much in Auburn, which is a sister city of Opelika, and was the key. So 6 months after we bought that little daily, which was really considered, I think, the worst paper in Alabama at that time. I mean, they ran nothing on the front page except wire news. They just, back in those days, you could take the wire news off the machine and fill up your paper, which some papers kept doing and still do today. Well, we ran local. We started covering Auburn, and 6 months later, we changed the name to the Opelika Auburn News so that we could have that extension into Auburn, and also added a Sunday edition, which they'd never had. And those were the two keys, I think, to expanding and succeeding in Opelika. Auburn, I should say. The plant was in Opelika. And we did a lot of photos. We covered sports very heavily in Auburn sports. And 9 years later, we had gone from 6,000 circulation to 9,000. That's one reason I call that the golden age of newspapers, because back in those days, you could gain circulation, which is very hard to do now. But of course, we didn't charge much. I mean, it was like a dime during the week and a quarter on Sunday. And I've forgotten what the monthly price was. And the Opelika Auburn area was extremely competitive in those days from outside newspapers. And then there was a strong weekly in Auburn that was actually stronger when we bought the Daily News than it was. But you had Columbus, Montgomery, Birmingham, and Atlanta all sent in both afternoon and morning papers into Lee County, Alabama. And two of them had bureaus there, Columbus and Birmingham. Birmingham had a real strong circulation there when we first went there. But in any case, as I was saying, we went from 6,000 to 20,000 in 9 years and quadrupled the income, which was lucky in a way. But we had this plan, as I said, the reason it was a golden age, we bought it for about $1 million and sold it for about $7 million 8 years later to Thompson newspapers. Boy, Thompson didn't do as good a job as I was hoping they would, but at that time they were the largest owner of small papers in the country, and they owned newspapers all over the world, including the London Times. I told the guy when we were selling, I said, boy, I'm real proud to be associated with a group that owns the London Times. He said, well, that's one of the newspapers we got that doesn't make money. So that was...
Let's talk for a minute about some of the real newspaper men during that era. Mm-hmm. Who do you recall that were outstanding journalists during that period?
Well, as I mentioned, people who worked on the Red and Black when I was there went on to be pretty outstanding. One who probably doesn't get enough recognition is Ray Jenkins, who was on at Georgia at that time and worked on the Phoenix City story during the Pulitzer year, and then went on to be editor of the Montgomery papers. And I think one of the really great writers of that period was Grover Hall, Jr., who was the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. Grover got mixed up one time when they sold it to somebody, and he left Montgomery, which was really, he never became as good a writer after that, because Montgomery was his heart. That's where his father had lived and been editor of the Montgomery paper. But Grover was a unique writer. He made editorials interesting, which is hard to do. I mean, most newspapers sort of throw the editorial page in as without the kind of thought and writing that Hall put in it. So he's one, of course he was in Alabama, but he was one person I feel was very important in influencing me. And he and Bob Brown were good friends, who was editor of The Ledger. You know, when you were in Columbus back in those days, and I worked on the Columbus paper for 20 years and then on the Opelika Auburn News for another 10. And even though I was very involved in Georgia, just across the line, for those 30 years, I was much more involved with the people right there. And although I knew some of the others, I mentioned Jim Fain and Jim Bellows came from the Columbus. I was actually on the board of the Georgia Press Association as well as the Alabama Press Association. So knew a lot of those people, but I don't know if the names would be that familiar to anybody. Bob Fowler was one who started the Gwinnett Daily News, and he sold it to the New York Times, you know, for $15 million, and they closed it down fine.
Before I forget, I'd like to ask you your opinion of what makes a good daily newspaper.
Well, it's a good question, and I have thought about it a lot through the years. When we bought the Opelika paper, as I said, it was not real good, I'd have to say. I would say both then and now, even more so, you had to cover the local news. Television had already been a factor for nearly 20 years when we took over the Opelika paper, but obviously it was not the factor it is today. You didn't have cable, and you didn't have quite as close a coverage. And I think covering the local news is number one, and everybody says that, but there are a lot of ways you do that, and then you know you've got a lot of audiences out there. You've got an audience that wants a lot of sports news, and probably some papers overemphasize sports, and I'm a big sports fan. And just to mention, to compare what we did in Opelika and Auburn, we started really covering Auburn sports, and we covered high school sports. I don't know how many high schools we must have covered. They had so many then, because all these counties were getting private schools in addition to the public schools. And Alabama has a lot of public schools. In Lee County there was Beulah and Beauregard and Notasulga and Lochapoka, as well as Opelika and Auburn. They all had Indian names. And so we covered high schools real closely. We ran a lot of pictures. We will probably, and I think that's a key for papers today. We do that in our weeklies, is run a lot of pictures of people. It's one thing that is still difficult for any of the other media to do. Plus, we ran obituaries, deaths and funerals, which very few papers, very few other, the media doesn't do well, except newspapers. So I think today, notice the Journal-Constitution has emphasized deaths and funerals a little bit more, spotlighting somebody. And I think the event column has become very popular, and many newspapers are doing that now to try to give the audience a chance to participate. But I would say that our success in Opelika and Auburn, which I think was reflected in a lot of dailies, was increasing the amount of local news and running more pictures. We also, of course, ran a lot of columns. And I would like to mention another trend that we got into after we sold the Opelika Auburn News. We really didn't have that much money. I didn't have but about 15% of that paper. But I didn't have any money, of course, when it started. I'd been in the newspaper business all my life. And I had to borrow what I had in it. But then we got into suburban papers, because suburban papers in the late 70s and early 80s were about the only thing small group with not much resources could buy. But you could get real good bargains in suburban papers because the dailies, the large groups, had not discovered the suburban papers. And of course, in the next 20 years, those suburban papers became real hot commodities. Our first one was, Phoenix City was sort of a suburban paper. Our first one was the Rockdale Citizen in Conyers, which I got right after we left, sold off like Auburn News, and we had it for 17 years. And it was a weekly when we bought it, and we converted it into a 5-day a daily, and ran an all-local front page. But we did have Y News inside, and we had comics, and we had other things. But somehow we managed to get all local on the front page. It was pretty tough some days. In Rockdale County, you wouldn't think that much happened, and I'm not sure it did, but it must have. Something happens all the time. You just have to be creative, I think. Mm-hmm. But at one time, we had the paper in Rockdale, Clayton County, which was a real good county back in those days for news, where Newt Gingrich was headquartered, so to speak. Henry County, which I never guessed was going to grow like it has, and Fayette County, which obviously was a hot county, but at the time we had the paper there, didn't even have a motel. You had to go to either Newnan or Clayton County to spend the night. And all those counties, of course, became very strong.
You mentioned editorials.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that newspaper editorials help to form public opinion?
Well, I don't know for sure. That's what I have mainly done through the years, is write editorials and columns. I never was a reporter too long. I started being an editor, that is. So I don't know how many back when I was editor of the Inquirer, we had to write about 2 or 3 editorials a day and a column and oversee the paper. I mean, back those days, the editors really worked. I think today they just write maybe an editorial once in a while. I never got a lot of feedback from editorials. I think letters to the editor get more feedback almost. And I say that as somebody who wrote editorials and thought they were pretty good, and still do write. I still write a column pretty much every week, but I think the news has more impact on people, not just for selling the paper to them, but even for influencing them. I think they look on editorials as somebody else's opinion. So I'm not sure.
Now, with your permission, I'd like to get your thoughts on some of Georgia's most well-known political writers and editorialists. And of course, the first one that comes to mind is Ralph McGill.
Yeah. Well, I thought he was real good. I mean, I used to read his column regularly. I'm sure he must have had some influence on the situation that evolved in Georgia. But I think the person who had the most influence was Carl Sanders, who was the governor during the 60s at a time when, if you remember the 60s, cities all over the South were exploding, states. Of course, living on the Alabama border, I was quite familiar with what was going on in Birmingham, Montgomery, various places. Somehow, if you look at the difference in Georgia and Alabama during the 1960s, when Wallace was governor in Alabama and Sanders was governor in Georgia, you can see that Georgia fared much better and became the commercial capital of the South, particularly Atlanta. Now, I don't know what you can give Sanders or McGill, either one, credit for all that, but Sanders particularly was in a position to sort of keep things calm. And as I've said, Sanders while he was governor, all three major league sports brought teams to Atlanta. Baseball with the Braves, and Atlanta built that great stadium, which I still think was great because you saw it when you came into the city real vividly and dramatically. Brought the Falcons, the NFL football team, and then the Hawks, the basketball team. And I think that put Atlanta on every sports page in the country, a little line every morning in the major league sports. And then you had that stadium, which many people, came to. And I think also it probably gave Atlanta that boost that Birmingham and even some of the others, Charlotte for a long time, and Jacksonville didn't have because they had the major league teams. And you have to give Sanders a lot of credit for that because he personally brought a couple of those teams in. And he and Ivan Allen, working together, got that stadium built in something like a year, didn't he? You remember, you were there, I'm sure. And that was really one of the miracles of Georgia. It also was the period when the major hotels all came to Atlanta. The Hyatt Regency, the Marriott, later the Peachtree Plaza, whatever it was, Westin. And then, of course, and I think Sanders cleared the way for a lot of that by convincing people outside of Georgia that we were calm. I don't know if we were all that calm or not. But in any case, that all came about. You know, McGill died in 69 or 70. So, but I think his influence and Patterson's influence helped keep Atlanta, gave it an image in any case. And that's very important, of course. And I think we had an image, Atlanta and Georgia did, that was much better than the other states. And still, it created the atmosphere that enabled us to finally get the Olympics and so forth.
Let's talk about that period for a moment. Preceding Sanders as governor was Ernest Vandiver, who most people believe was one of the most courageous governors we ever had because of the circumstances he faced during his administration. What did you think about that period?
Well, I think he felt like he had to do what he did, which was allow integration here at the university and integration in general. When we did this article on Sanders for Georgia Trend years later, Vandiver wrote me a letter and was upset that he felt like he should have gotten more credit because he allowed the integration and so forth. But I think it was reluctant, and I mean, in his campaign for governor, he vowed never to allow any kind of integration, which I think he carried, every county but 3. So apparently it was the right way. But I felt like Sanders did more than Vandiver overall because he came in and sort of, I can't remember all the things he did. Of course, he was a great education governor and brushed up on some of that, but I know he did a lot of things. And Vandiver did. He had a tough time and allowed the integration of university, 2 or 3 people. And, he was a good governor. Most of our really great governors never were elected to anything else. I thought Ellis Arnold was a very progressive governor. Never was elected again. Sanders never was elected to anything again.
Vandiver.
And Vandiver was never elected to anything again.
Yeah.
So we don't reward our real progressive officials too well.
Do you remember that race in 1966 when Governor Arnold ran against a group of people which included Lester Maddox and even Bo Calloway from from down in your way was the Republican.
Yeah.
What do you remember about that race?
Well, quite a bit. I wrote a little book about it. I was out at the Enquirer then, and was a pretty good acquaintance of Bo Calloway. You know, he had become the first congressman, Republican congressman, 2 years earlier, and that was the district that Columbus was in. And of course, Pine Mountain was very near Columbus, and we would go over there a lot. And Calloway today will admit that he ran a very bad campaign, that he should have won, because what happened was there were 4 major candidates running for the Democratic nomination, maybe 5, I guess you could say. And Maddox only got something like 19% of the vote, but that was enough to get him into a runoff with Arnold, who got about 28%. Mm-hmm. And you know, Garland Byrd was in that race, and Jimmy Carter, who came in 3rd, mm-hmm. And James Gray, who was sort of the establishment candidate. So there were 5 major candidates, yeah. Mm-hmm. And then Arnold beat Maddox in the runoff. And of course, there were a lot of rumors that the Republicans voted for Maddox because they thought he'd be easier to beat. But I don't think that was true. If you analyze the vote in the primary and the general election, the counties that went heavily for Arnold in the runoff were the same ones that went heavily for Calloway in the general election. So I don't think there was quite as much so-called crossover voting as people thought. As you recall, Calloway finished slightly ahead of Maddox in the general election, about 3,000 votes, but he didn't get a majority. And at that time, the General Assembly selected the governor from the top 2. And of course, the General Assembly was heavily Democratic still and selected Maddox over Calloway. I think that delayed the Republican domination of Georgia politics for several years because, of course, Calloway was the last Republican to get more votes in the general election than the Democrat until Perdue in 2002.
Mm-hmm. The demise of the county unit system in Georgia, which a lot of people nowadays don't understand.
Yeah.
Don't you think opened the door to better government in the state?
Oh, absolutely. I was a strong opponent of the county unit system when I was at Georgia. Some of my editorials was out to the Red and Black were against the county unit system, because it just seemed to me it wasn't fair. And of course, we had a lot of cases where, it wasn't so much that we had a lot of cases where the person who got the fewest votes won, although that did happen in 1946 when Gene Talmadge got fewer votes than the guy he was running against.
Jimmy Carmichael.
But most of the time it was because the county unit system gave people who only got 35, 40% of the vote, they were the winners. I think that was the case with Marvin Griffin when he ran. You know, Herman Talmadge, that only applied to Democratic primaries, the county unit system did. Talmadge twice tried to get that put into the Constitution to apply to the general election, and it was defeated actually in Georgia. And of course, while it cleared the way for Sanders to win, actually he would have won anyway. He carried the county unit system. Maddox would have won heavily had it been on the county unit basis in 1966. But anyway, he went on to become a fairly acceptable governor, I guess. Mm-hmm. And Bo Calloway finally moved to Colorado and then came back. And I see him quite often now at Callaway Gardens. He lives there now.
In Chipley.
Well, Pine Mountain, they call it.
Chipley.
Yeah.
Still Chipley to me.
Yeah, I wish they hadn't changed the name because it's confusing with Pine Mountain Valley, not to mention the mountain. Chipley, some things around there still called Chipley.
I'd like to ask you this question.
All right.
Do you think there's more or less interest in today's newspapers in investigative reporting?
Well, I haven't noticed that there is. Atlanta still does a lot. Columbus does some. The paper up in Jefferson does quite a bit. I think it's difficult for small papers to devote the resources and so forth, depending on what the investigation is. I think if we can report the news, which is what we try to do, and report what's going on, sometimes that almost feels like investigative reporting. We had a situation in Greenville, Georgia recently, in which the guy elected mayor was not living there. And we brought that out and took a picture of this mobile home that he had as his address, which was obviously abandoned. And, and nothing, I don't know, they finally put a judge in charge of the county, of the town. And he's mayor now, and he claims he lives there. But he really, I think, doesn't. That was not really investigative reporting. What we do is try to bring out what's happening. And we have a little paper in Talbot County, which is certainly one of the smallest counties in Georgia. But you remember Talbot County? You know, the Henry Jordan,
Yeah.
and Persons.
Yeah.
They were from Talbot County.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another prominent family. And the Strausses were from there, who founded Macy's department store. And they have just, in this election, elected the first black sheriff and the first black probate judge in Talbot County ever, even though it's about 80% black. And so coming into this year, we'll have a black judge and a black sheriff for the first time in Talbot County.
Speaking of that, how did you treat the civil rights movement from a news standpoint in your newspapers?
Well, in Columbus, we had a real strong family ownership. The Chapmans and the Ashworths, during all the years I worked at the Columbus paper, was later sold to Knight Ridder. I think they had real good newspapers because they wanted real good newspapers. But I would have to say we mainly covered it by ignoring it. We did not, during the 1960s, we did not play up civil rights commotions around. And we were kind of like the eye of the storm. Not only Georgia, but Columbus in particular. To my knowledge, never had a riot, never had any problems. And I don't think it was strictly because of the newspapers, but we didn't have many problems. They integrated the schools. In fact, my children were in the first wave of integrated schools in Columbus. And I think Columbus probably has more problems than it did then. But we did not play it up big, and I'll never forget the first time a black couple brought in an engagement and wanted to run a wedding. The publisher was really against it. So we finally ran it, but we didn't run it in the society section. We ran it back in the grocery section, I think, and they got real upset. But he was, I don't know, he was an old-time Southern publisher, and we forget how, and well, not very easily, but I mean, most of the people were, of course, strongly segregationist. We didn't run high school sports on blacks, and we've all changed. Now we can't hardly get any whites in. So
What happened, do you think, to change that attitude?
I don't know. I don't know that the attitude changed so much as just circumstances. We had to, both from a commercial, a business standpoint and a rights standpoint, I guess. and a readership standpoint. Oh, you know, we forget, we say newspapers in dire circumstances today, and to some extent they are. But, you know, we never had blanket readership because the blacks didn't read the newspapers back in the 50s and the 60s. And that was true for Atlanta and Columbus. Even though we had huge, I'd say a third of the population, we didn't run any news that appealed to them. We didn't, like I say, run sports. The only thing we ran about blacks, frankly, was crime. You know, maybe church news and obituaries, which were carefully segregated. But, you know, that was 40 years ago. We forget how much that has changed. But today, I think our weekly newspapers run more about blacks in those counties than we do about whites, including social events and so forth and pictures. And they got mad with us. One guy, the county commissioner, got ready to run a banner story about Obama winning the presidency. But we don't run, you know, we didn't run one when Bush won. In fact, I don't think we even ran one when Roosevelt won. Oh, he lived there, you know, in Meriwether County, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That's just not what weekly newspapers do. I mean, we ran how he ran in Meriwether County, Obama and McCain. Interestingly, Obama carried Meriwether County slightly, and going back, I think, perhaps to the Roosevelt influence is still strong in Meriwether County. Democrats have remained pretty dominant there.
Did you visit any with President Roosevelt when he came to Warm Springs?
No, I was just a child. You know. But I was always I'm a sort of a Roosevelt historian, I guess you'd say, and I've always been proud of the fact that we have a paper there and can promote Warm Springs and promote the historic role that Warm Springs played. Just a few weeks ago, I carried a friend of mine out on Dowdall's Knob there in Meriwether County, which was where Roosevelt looked out over Pine Mountain Valley, and where he went the day before he died to look out over the valley. And the grill that he used is still there. And there's a statue there of him now that was dedicated just last year, if you haven't seen it, that overlooks the valley.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a minute about party politics in Georgia. Mm-hmm. How long do you think the Republican Party will be able to continue its dominance in the state of Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I think still depends a lot on individuals. Right now, if you want to win an office in Georgia, in a lot of places, you figure you got to run as a Republican. For many years, we know that was true. People wanted to win an office, they ran as a Democrat, no matter how they felt at the national level or at the state level. And at the state level, you know, issues didn't break down along party lines. I don't know if they do now, although they make them. I think, as I said, I was a strong supporter of the two-party system, but I'm not sure now that one-party politics doesn't work better, because you don't have these conflicts develop as easily over issues that really aren't issues, but become party issues, you know. And I think the Republicans have gotten to squabbling among themselves about who's going to run next year. So, I don't know, we may develop a real two-party system. We've sort of gotten away from, we almost went back to the one-party system, with the Republicans being the party. Last time, I think, what Purdue get, about 60%, 65% of the vote, mainly because blacks still vote heavily Democratic, and I think they will continue to. And I assume Hispanics will continue to to vote Democratic. So counties change so drastically. Rockdale County, which, like I said, we own the newspaper there for 17 years, operated it has changed from being solidly Democratic when we bought the newspaper to solidly Republican, and it's almost back again to being Democratic because blacks now make up something like almost 50% of the population. And when I had the newspaper there, it was about 90% white. Mm-hmm. And that does affect politics. We can't get away from the fact that it's a very strong influence on politics.
Many disenchanted Democrats feel the Georgia party is too urban and too dependent on minorities and labor. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's true?
Well, yeah. I think that's why the Democrats need to nominate somebody from below Macon for governor who can help them pull rural votes, because they're going to get the urban vote now around Atlanta, and that's a heavy vote. But if you looked at the last election, last month or November, it's rural counties below Macon and up in the mountains that vote so heavily Republican. Mm-hmm. And so I think they've got to get somebody who can pull votes down in the south part of the state, because we're still we're not only party line voters, we're regional line. It's always been a very regional basis for the vote. And I think a guy like DuBois Porter might be able to win a statewide race, be able to run. So,
mm-hmm. Getting back to newspapering, what effect has television had on newspapers and the internet? Mm-hmm. Has that affected circulation?
Well, yeah, obviously.
Yeah. I
mean, Atlanta's pulled back, Columbus was pulled back. You can't even get an Atlanta paper now in Harris County down there where I spend a lot of time. And I actually hate starting the day without an Atlanta paper, although sometimes I get upset about various things, about the way they cover news, not their positions, and about the way I feel that obviously newspapers face a challenge to their very existence right now. Actually, when I got out of college, people were saying that because television had just begun carrying news, and they said, well, this is going to mean the end of newspapers. But it wasn't. It was the beginning, as I said, of the golden age. Now, right now, young people don't read newspapers. My children don't read newspapers, and they were raised in the business. So I don't know where we're heading in the newspaper business. I've been in large dailies, fairly large, small dailies, and then weeklies. I think weeklies still have a pretty good niche. And I think that's the key for newspapers, is to maintain a niche in the market for media, just as radio has managed to do, and as a lot of magazines have managed to do. I think newspapers used to feel like they had to be the dominant media, that everybody had to take it, and that's not going to happen anymore. But what they've got to do is aim at the market they can serve and the role they can fill and can sell advertisers on. I mean, advertising still pays the way for all these media. But the Columbus papers and the Atlanta papers did something last week that I thought was really dumb, and that was increase their price. We don't get much money out of circulation in the newspaper business. What we really want is circulation. Well, when you go up a quarter from 50 cents, as Columbus did, that's a 50% increase. May not seem like much, but I mean, it makes a difference. I know when sometime I'm trying to buy a paper on a rack, I might not have but 2 quarters or 3 quarters when it's $1. Back in the old days, of course, when I was first coming along, like I say, newspapers were a nickel or a dime. Because we were a mass media. We got to realize there's other media out there, television, internet. They are considered free by most people. So I think we've got to hold down our cost. The newspapers got accustomed to such high profit margins, these groups. They had these plans, and they did make way too high profit margins. If you pick up your Sunday Journal-Constitution, though, if you can pick it up, it's still hard to pick up because it carries so many inserts. Same way is true of Athens, lots of other papers. Even a little paper like our Manchester Star-Mercury averages about 6 inserts a week, and that's on a county that hardly has any stores in it. It really doesn't. So newspapers still have a function, just to carry inserts and hopefully get a few other ads. And tell people, we still are the only medium that tells people who got born, who died, who won the homecoming queen crown, who won the local football game, who scored the winning touchdown. So from birth to death, it's the little incidents that weekly newspapers can still carry, and a lot of dailies. And but we've got to get away from charging too much, I think, to remain a mass media. And there's just a lot of competition out there, and we've got to try to make sure we're one of the competitors, newspapers.
Can you see any way to encourage young people to read newspapers more?
Well, I guess, as I said, I get discouraged watching my own children and grandchildren. And I think they do look at sports still. Sports is one thing they seem to still go to the newspaper for, because you don't get that much sports off television. Even when it carries a game, you don't know exactly what happened. You don't know who the leading ground gainer was. I was watching the Tech-Georgia game last night in basketball, but I still didn't know who the leading scorer was or anything about, you didn't know really the detail. If you want to know the details, you got to look in the newspaper the next day. And I know my daughters, they look for stuff about their children. If there's something about their children, it's still real important. My grandson is a pitcher for the Norcross High team, and I used to drive over to Winder in the mornings to pick up a Gwinnett paper to see what they had about the games he pitched. So, and I'm sure that people still do look for items in the newspaper about events they were involved with. It's hard to get that kind of stuff off the internet or off television. So this probably isn't what they teach in journalism college, but that is what we've got to become. And we can also, we still cover all the county commission meetings, school board meetings that nobody else is at. And we've just got to make that kind of news more relevant to the reader on what the county commission is doing. Because, you can sit through a long session and not get much. So I think I'm optimistic a little bit that we can continue being a niche provider of information. But can we keep selling ads to the people? That's a big issue, because our main advertisers through the years, newspapers, grocery stores, which we no longer have, retail stores, which are fading out, and automobile dealers, which had a terrible year, and real estate. All 4 of those areas are hurting right now. Walmart kind of killed the retail business because they don't advertise much. And they showed retailers they didn't have to advertise to be successful. And so about all retailers right now are inserts. We'd come to rely a lot on auto dealers. They were kind of the new supermarkets. And then last year they had a terrible year, and I just don't know if they come back, maybe will help us.
You mentioned magazines.
Yeah.
Which brings up the Georgia Trend.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Georgia Trend.
Well, after I got out of the Opelika Auburn News, as I said, we mainly ran these suburban dailies during the 1980s. And then in 1991, I'd always really loved magazines. As I said, when I was a kid, buying comic books and science fiction magazines is what really got me interested in writing. And so I'd always thought, if I could ever get a magazine, that'd be great. And Georgia Trend, you know, when it first started, it was started by Gene Patterson when he worked on the St. Petersburg Times. And they had a Florida Trend. It was a business and political magazine. Well, the recession of the early 90s was very hard on print media. You know, I was reading an article yesterday which finally compared the recessions of the post-war era, and the one in the early 90s was pretty bad. I don't think a lot of folks realized how bad it was. We did in the newspaper business because I know in Rockdale County we had never had a year in which we did not do more business than we'd done the year before until 1990. And the magazine trade got hit very hard by Atlanta Magazine, Georgia Trend. Anyway, St. Pete decided to sell its magazines, and so we got Georgia Trend at a pretty good deal. And but I mean, it was like losing about $1 million a year, so you had to kind of act fast. But it was in this tower in downtown Atlanta. That was my it was great, you know, the Atlanta Gas Light Tower at Peachtree Center. We had an office up on the top floor, and you could almost reach out and touch the blue dome there on the Hyatt Regency. And I really enjoyed, it was a highlight of my career almost, was running Georgia Trend. And we later moved it, we moved out to Norcross to an office, but we also had an office here, which is where we actually put it out. It was in Athens, because I lived here and I didn't want to move, so we had an Atlanta office, but we actually put Georgia Trend out here in Athens, and I thought it was a great opportunity to tell stories about Georgia that I had not been. I did have another magazine, Georgia Journal, it was called, you may remember, and it focused on tourism and gardens and towns, and it was very popular with some people, but not enough, and you couldn't get ads for it. But you could sell ads in Georgia Trend because we mailed it to everybody in tourism and government and CEOs and so forth. If they just asked for it, they got it. So that was the way you had circulation. And you had about 50,000 of the key people. And it had a lot of features folks still like Top 100 and the Georgian of the Year. And so it was a lot of fun. And I got Bill Shipp to come over from Atlanta Magazine and be the write a column for it. Bill never was involved in the production or anything, but he did write a column every week. And we had some terrific photographers, which I think were very important. But I sort of burned out because I wanted the magazine to be a certain way, and so I think I kind of burned out trying to do too much on it, writing every headline, every cut line. But my children worked with me on it, 2 of them did, and it was a great experience. And I thought we wrote some great stories, like I said, the one on Carl Sanders. And I remember one article Jim Minner wrote for us called Is Henry County the Next Gwinnett? And actually that was in 1992, and it did become the next Gwinnett almost. Not quite. I think it's on its way to becoming what Gwinnett's becoming now. And we did an article on Vandiver later on, and his role, which was very important. He was still bitter with Carter for not appointing him to the Senate, you know, when Russell died. And I did a series on Bo Calloway and how he ran for governor and his life, both in tourism and in politics, which I've got a little booklet of. I'd like to give you. Mm-hmm. But in any case, that was about, had some, we managed to write it up. I mean, it became a strong advertising medium during the 90s as the economy improved. And then after we sold Georgia Trend back to people we'd sold our South Metro Atlanta papers to, Neely Young and Tom Cousins, 10 years ago, 1999, I got these little weeklies down around there where Charlotte, my wife, and I had grown up. And that's what we've done for 10 years, and it's been sort of a tough road.
I imagine you stay pretty busy with that number of weekly newspapers.
Well, not real busy, because I'm here. I'm in Athens. I live in Athens, and they're all 140 miles away, so you don't have to be quite as involved, but I'm pretty involved with them. And
well, you've certainly had a brilliant career. You've also introduced some people into journalism, Louis Grizzard.
yeah.
Tell us about Louis.
Well, Louis was a sports writer on the Athens Banner Herald, and a couple of guys and I got this idea to start a paper here in Athens back in 1965. Glenn Vaughn and Claude Williams were the main, well, they turned out to be the main people, but I went to Claude, who had a little weekly here, and asked him about what he thought about turning it into a daily and challenging the Banner Herald, which at that time was a fairly weak newspaper, and we knew it was going to be sold. I mean, because the person who owned it had died. It was in his estate and had to be sold by the end of the year in 1965. And about the only thing I did for that paper, except kind of give them the idea, I was still in Columbus at that time, I was editor of the paper in Columbus, was hire the sports editor of the Banner Herald, which was a guy named Wade Say. Because we felt like, hey, if we have a really good sports editor and section, that'll give us a start. I think Wade was making like $60 a week, and so we offered him $70. He said he'd come if he could bring this intern he had, and that was Louis Grizzard. So that's how Louis came to the Athens Daily News, and in his book, if I ever get back to Georgia, he recounts his experiences on the Daily News, which he remembered very fondly, and particularly Glenn Vaughn, who came up and was the publisher. Glenn was in Columbus with me at that time. Decided I couldn't come, he came.
Rita Grimsley Johnson.
Yeah, remember Rita.
Mm-hmm.
She was still here writing for the Journal-Constitution. She worked for the Opelika-Auburn News while she was a student at Auburn, met her husband there. He was working as an assistant sports editor, Johnson. And Rita was a great columnist, even when she was very young. And went on to become he's still a columnist for Scripps Howard, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she is.
But I have not seen Rita in several years.
Mm-hmm. If someone asks you for suggestions for a young journalist who is just beginning a career, what would you tell them?
Well, I don't know. I might tell them to try to get into the electronic media some way. But because it's a hard, well, I won't say it's a hard job. It's difficult in a way. I feel very fortunate to have been in a position in the media for so many years. There's no heavy lifting, as we say, and you usually get to stay out of the hot and cold unless you get sent to one of these foreign assignments. But it can be long hours. It kind of depends on the individual. I've had people who'd work 12 hours a day and others would work 4 or 5 and do the same amount of work. Some people just get married to the job or like going there. I think newspapers, as I said, have a niche role to play. There's also magazines, which most newspapers are now putting out magazines. It's amazing to me how many magazines suddenly have sprung up in the last few years. I was a lot when I was in the magazine business back in the 90s. But Mark Smith, who used to be here in Athens as publisher and worked for Morris for many years, his father, his family owned the paper in Eatonton, and Mark took it over when he retired from Morris and has done a great job of expanding it into the Lake Oconee community. And he puts out 2 or 3 magazines and puts them in there. He has a real estate health magazine and then a regular magazine. And Union Paper puts out 2 magazines, I think, and Columbus puts one out. It's real funny, everybody puts one out now except Atlanta, which started the newspaper magazine business many years ago. You were saying, looking at these questions you sent me about great experiences, achievements, and disappointments. I guess I'm mainly a news journalist, I guess you'd say, and so I enjoy that part of it. But my greatest achievement undoubtedly was in Opelika, where we increased the everything so much. I think that there's a lot of luck involved. By going into Auburn, we became a broader-based paper, and then somebody opened a big shopping mall between Opelika and Auburn, and that always helps when you're a publisher. And of course, I had 2 great circulation people. One of them was a real good friend of Rita Grimsley Johnson's, in fact, and they managed to get our circulation just expanded all of a sudden. And back in those days, you could do that into the valley and into the surrounding area. And I think my greatest disappointment is that I haven't been able to develop a successor. I have 3 children, 2 of whom have worked in the business, but I don't know whether they're really going to be able to be a successor, and I haven't been able to find any people that have worked for me. I think you need a good business type, and most of the successful papers and other companies have had that. I've never had a really great business type. And I'm sure that's hurt our company. We're probably poorer today because of it. But newspapers took a real hit during the past year, as did a lot of companies. And we just got to hope that for the whole nation and world's sake that 2009 is going to be a better year some ways. I'm 78 years old. As I said, I was born just a few months after the Great Depression started. It looks like I'd be going out that way.
Well, let's hope not. Millard Grimes, a great journalist, a great Georgian. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Richard Russell Library, the University of Georgia, and myself for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Bob, and I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate you asking me.